Congratulations, you are now finally ready to start sewing. Now I have immediately gone to views G, H, and I because that is the top that I'm doing. So if you are sewing along with me, you'll start there, but it is possible depending on what style that you're making that you're in a different section, just as a reminder, okay? So the first part says that we're going to reinforce the bodice front. So let's do that. So you should be using piece 5 to do this, and the top here is where you're going to be reinforcing the seam. So I actually have both of the right sides of my fabric, and then I also have both of my lining pieces because all of them have to be reinforced and clipped. So it doesn't matter which side you start on. Grab any one of those pieces, and at 5/8 you're just going to start slowly stitching until you get to about 5/8 on the other side. And see how I turn this and 5/8 is actually here? That means I need to go further. Right, turn it again, still need to go a little further. I just want it to be 5/8. Alright, 5/8. Now, okay, so that is what that looks like. It does go to the dot. It's always good to actually measure the first one using your machine at 5/8 just to make sure that the dot has been marked in the correct place. Sometimes you'll find that that is not actually correct on patterns. And then you'll just cut not through, but to the stitching. And that helps this piece to move more freely. So that's one down. Now let's do the next one. We know now that the dot marking is actually accurate, so if I turn when I get to the dot, that will be 5/8. Alright, there's my next one. Once again, taking my scissors and clipping right to that dot. Alright, to the stitching but not through it. That takes care of both the lining pieces. Now I'm doing the right side of my fabric. Need to sharpen my scissors again. Alright, and the last one. No, that one needs to go further. There we go. Alright, so we're just going to move on now. Now I'll keep these out here because I need them again. Now the next thing we're going to work on is our tuck here. So this is a good time to reference your pattern again, because the next step has a picture of how to do that. Now we're ready to make our tuck in our bodice front pieces, and that means that I am using piece 5, and this is my tuck. So I'm going to be using these dots that I marked out earlier. So usually for things like this, if you're doing a tuck or a pleat, I would tell you to grab your pattern instructions because sometimes it helps to look at the picture. So the first thing it says is to make tuck in bodice front, on inside bring lines of small circles together. So on the inside means that we need the wrong side of the fabric. So here we go. These are the 4 dots that we marked before. I'm actually just going to take a second to trim out these extra threads. Those of you who subscribe to my channel know that that's a pet peeve of mine. I hate loose threads. Okay, so we are on the inside of the fabric, but we want to put the right sides together. So I'm just going to put a pin through that dot and go to the other dot just to put those together. Okay, so there's one. I'm going to do the same thing with the top one. Put a pin through. And then find the top dot. Alright. Oh, that one came out. Alright, there we go. Alright, so once you have pinned that together, you should have something that looks like this. Alright, so now we're just going to stitch a line directly from that top dot to the bottom dot. No higher and no further down. So just stitch here and then stitch to the bottom dot. So let's do that together now. Alright, here we go. Making sure everything's lined up. Stitch, back stitch a little, and then stitch down to that dot. And then back stitch again. Alright. And you'll do that for both of your bodice front pieces and both of your lining pieces. I've already done all 4 of mine. I just wanted to do this one so that you guys could see it. And because I can't stand it, I will go ahead and trim out all of these loose threads that drive me absolutely bonkers. You should always trim your threads. Sometimes they get caught in things and they mess up your seams and they're just annoying. They're also not very pretty to look at. Alright. So once you have stitched all 4 of those, the next thing you'll want to do is press. So I'm going to go to the iron board, and remember earlier how we cut this open, this flap, so that it could move around? If you just fold this over, this is what you would have. The reason you cut that open is so that you could open this while this is pressed on top of it. See that? So we basically have created a new seam line here with these pieces. So go ahead and go press these down and press your fold here to the side, and then once you've done that for all 4 pieces, come join me again. Now for the next section that we're working on, I'm supposed to be using stay tape. However, I went to Hobby Lobby where I usually get stay tape and they were completely sold out because of coronavirus and they can't get everything in and stuff is selling out the second they get it in. So instead what I have here is just some ribbon, and I'm going to use this as my stay tape basically, and I just tried to get something that wouldn't show through my fabric. So I took a little sample, and as you can see this doesn't show through, so that's great. One thing I'm going to do, this is my bodice top, so I'll turn it like this. This stay tape is essentially going to be sewn over our 5/8 inch seam here, and it will just strengthen the seam and keep it from stretching. However, I don't like hand marking where my seam is going to be, so what I'm going to do instead is just use a long stitch, so my longest basting stitch basically, and I'm just going to sew a basting stitch down this line here so that I can see exactly where I need to lay the ribbon. And that's just faster for me, and I prefer to do that, so I'll show you that now. Alright, so I have my longest basting stitch selected, and I'm just going to layer these two pieces on top because they should match up. Okay, and then I'm also going to put a pin in there because I want to make sure that that doesn't flip over on me. Okay, so it should look like this. It should be flat on both sides, and I'm just going to add that basting stitch, not quite at 5/8, a little bit less than 5/8 because I don't want this stitch to show later. So slightly less than 5/8 on the longest stitch that you have on your machine. That takes care of one side. Now remember, you have 4 of these pieces, so that's only one of my bodice pieces. And be careful that when you do your basting stitch, because sometimes this happens, it may make your fabric bunch a little. That's why it's usually used to make ruffles and things like that. So just make sure that that stitch is flat if you choose to do that like I did. Okay, so I'm just using my fingers to make that flat again. There, so this is now flat again and ready to be sewn. So I need to do that to both of the right sides of my fabric. I have 2 pieces like that to do. This is the other one, so I'm going to do the exact same thing. Just going to put another pin in here to make sure that this doesn't bunch up or get in the way. Alright. Then I'm going to do the exact same thing and stitch that slightly less than 5/8. It's entirely possible too, when you do this, you could just eyeball this and go ahead and sew your stay tape to your piece. I am not a guesser, I guess, when it comes to sewing. I really like to know exactly where mathematically I'm supposed to be placing things. I take great comfort in that when I'm sewing, so I don't take chances. If I can mark something, I will do it, especially if I can do it with a basting, which is super fast. Alright, I'm just smoothing this out to make sure I don't have any weird gathers. If for any reason you're working with your fabric and you get some weird gathers, if you take your scissors and you just cut like every couple of inches one of these, it will smooth itself out again. Alright, so we should now have both of your front pieces here, and we're going to add stay tape just to the front fabric pieces. So your bodice front with the nicer fabric that you're sewing with, not the lining. And I'm going to take my stay tape and I want to place it so that the basting line is right in the middle of the stay tape. And I'm just going to start pinning that in place. If you feel comfortable with it, you can also just go to your sewing machine and freehand this. I'm not doing that right now because I want to show any of you who are absolute beginners, the safest way to do it, but if I was sewing it on my own, that's what I would recommend. I would just go to the sewing machine and freehand this. Okay. And just make sure whenever you're pinning your ribbon or stay tape to your dress that you're not making it tight, because you don't want it to be so tight that it starts to pull on the fabric, because it will pucker when you wear it and it won't look nice. So just keep smoothing it out. Don't pull things, just let them loosely be together. They should be flat, but they should be comfortable. Nope. We're almost done with this side. Okay. And we'll do that all the way up to the top. And then the last thing you want to do when you get to the top, I know it's tempting to just go ahead and cut your fabric right at the end. Sometimes, depending on what fabric you're sewing with, you might find that this starts to move around as you stitch. I don't think mine will do that because I'm working with cotton, but some dress fabrics may do that. You may find things stretching on you. So give yourself like 1 or 2 inches of extra fabric just in case you find that you have to remove your pins and kind of just freehand sew this. That does happen sometimes. Okay, so make sure to do this also for the other side. I'm not going to show you that because you already know how to do it, but go ahead and pin this on both sides, and then I will show you how to stitch this on the sewing machine. Alright, so we're now ready to stitch this, and you should still be using a basting stitch, not a permanent stitch. So your stitch should still be set at the longest length. For me, that's 5. And it's very convenient for me because my ribbon basically has this middle line, and since I sewed right through that, my basting, I know that if I aim for the middle here, I'm going to be at exactly 5/8. Now, if you don't have a ribbon or stay tape like that, what you can also do is sew from the other side, and you can stitch right on top of that basting that you already did, or you can stitch slightly to the left of it if you want to go ahead and encase it. However, this is not the final seam, so it's okay if you don't encase it right now. So just to show you, I'll do this way because my ribbon will probably not look anything like yours. So let's do this so it works for everyone. Alright, so we're basting. And just go as slowly as you need to. If you feel scared about removing your pins, or you feel like the pins are going to pop out, as long as you're doing a basting stitch, you can actually sew right over the pins. So if any of you are brand new to sewing, there you go. See that? You can sew right on top of the pins. Just go slowly. You can figure out which way works better for you. I like to pull mine out, but I'd like to give you that option in case you need it. Okay, so there's one. That one's done. And that's what it looks like. So I'm going to do that same thing for the other side now. I won't show you that because I'm going to freehand that one. So basically I will lay my fabric like so, and I'm just going to layer this on top, and I'll just stitch it as I go using that same basting stitch. Alright, so do both of those sections to the right side of your fabric, meaning your nicer fabric pieces, not your lining, on the inside of your fabric, and then come join me again. So moving right along here, this is what you should have after you have finished sewing on your stay tape or ribbon or whatever it is that you have. You should have both of your front bodice pieces ready to go. Now what we're going to do is actually sew these together at the center front. So I'm just going to match up the bottom seam here and start pinning. And you can use a few pins or quite a few pins. It's really up to you and what you feel comfortable with. If you feel like you sew better when you have more pins in, then go ahead and just use a whole bunch. I'm just going to add one at the bottom, one at the top, and then one here at the notch. So we're going to stitch this together, and you're going to stitch it from the bottom to the top, or you can start at the top if you want, but make sure that you stop stitching at the large dot, which is marked on your pattern here, okay? So I have my pin in right where that dot is, so I know once I get to this pin, I need to stop sewing. Now the other thing I'm going to go ahead and do is I know that for the next section, whenever I keep sewing this, I'm going to be attaching my side pieces. So instead of stitching this and pressing it and coming back and reattaching my next two pieces, I'll just go ahead and pin them all together now so that I can stitch these all at the same time. So I'll leave that one pinned, flip this over so it's right sides up, and then these are my side pieces. So I will pin both of these together like so. And in this case I would match up the bottom sections and then go up from there, and the reason is because once you sew these together, you'll notice that the top will extend slightly and it looks like your pieces don't match up. See this, how this is taller? But it's normal for that to look like that because once you sew this together and you open this seam up, you'll see that you need that extra fabric there. So go ahead and pin your sides together, match up the bottom first, then match up your notch, and then add at least one more pin to the top. And then I'll take you to the sewing machine and show you how I stitch all of these so that I only have to do it once. So now I have all of my sides pinned here. This is a side, this is a side, and this is the front. So I'm just going to stitch all of these together, and I'm turning my machine off and then back on, and that's because I wanted to get rid of my basting stitch and go back to a regular stitch. So now I'm just going to stitch these together using 5/8 seam. So stitch, back stitch. There's one that's done. Now I'm going to do the center front, so just make sure you pull your sides out so you don't stitch anything through there you're not supposed to. Now I'm moving on to the front, so this is my front piece, and I am going to start right on top of where I placed that pin and mark from 5/8. So I'm stitching at 5/8 right in the place where that pin is so that I know where the dot is. Because I don't want to stitch above that, I just want to back stitch there and then continue on. So we'll just stitch a little, back stitch, and I'm actually going to do that again because this is the top of a bodice, so it will take a lot of push and pull while you're wearing it, so areas like that can sometimes use some extra reinforcement. Get to the bottom, I'll back stitch again. Okay, now I just have one side seam left. I'm going to do the same thing as I did with the other side seam. I'm going to stitch all of this together. So starting at the top in 5/8. Stitch, back stitch, and then just continue stitching these two pieces together. And then back stitch at the bottom. Now, what you'll need to do is go to the ironing board and press all of these seams open. So go press all 3 of these seams open, and then if you haven't yet, you're going to do the exact same thing with your lining pieces. So once you've finished all of this process, you will have, let me move this, you'll have your bodice like so, and then you'll also have a lining that looks the same as that. So this is my lining. So what I'm going to do now is stitch my lining pieces together at the front here because I've already stitched them at the sides, and then once I stitch those in the middle, it will look exactly the same as this piece. Okay? So stitch all of your fronts and sides together, go to the ironing board and press all of those seams open, press all 6 of those seams open, and then come join me again. If you're following along with me, this is what you should have now. This is my bodice top, this is my front, my side seams, and then I also have my lining. There's my front seam and then also my side seams here. So you should have 2 pieces that look the same. Now what we're going to do is something very similar to a step that we did before. However, before I get into that, I'm going to trim out some of these little things that drive me nuts. Let me just get rid of a couple of these loose threads. I also don't want them gunking up my machine. Highly recommend that you trim back your threads whenever you can. Okay, let me turn this so you guys can see it more easily. So this is the top of my bodice. The next thing that we're going to do is add this same trim ribbon or stay tape if you're using it to the side seams here. So I'm going to take my stay tape, which is here, or at least my form of stay tape, and I'm going to do the exact same thing that I did before for the front. So depending on how you want to do this, you can either add the basting that's slightly less than 5/8, just like we did for the front, and then you can pin this on top of it, or you can eyeball it. This time I will probably just eyeball this instead of doing the basting and sewing on top of my basting, and the reason is the sides I don't have to worry quite as much if they're not absolutely perfect, whereas the front I want it to be mathematically as precise as it can be, and that's because it's right in front of everyone's face. So if I make a mistake here, it's very obvious, but if something is just a centimeter or two off on the side, no one is going to notice that, okay? So I know from the front that I have about this much space because I measured this out equally. So I know that if I stitch in the middle of my ribbon or stay tape or whatever it is that you want to use, if I hold it that same distance away and stitch right down the middle, that means that I will be right where I'm supposed to be. Okay, so that's how I'm going to do these two sides. I'm just going to freehand those, and I will video doing one side of that so that you can see what it looks like, but I won't video both sides, okay? So I'm going to take this to the sewing machine and sew these together on one side so you can see it, but make sure that before you move to the next step that you've done it on this side and on the other side, okay? So let's stitch this. Alright, before I start this, I'm switching it to use my longest stitch, so my basting stitch. And then I'm just going to baste this down the middle while holding it the equal distance away. Alright, so that's a sample of what this will look like. Just keep on going down. If you feel more comfortable using the basting, then go ahead and use the basting. And I'm just going to keep doing that until I get to the end of the seam, okay? So do that for both sides and then come join me again. Alright, now things are getting more exciting because stuff is actually starting to look like clothing. So here are my sides. You can see I've added my stay tape ribbon to all of my front here. Now the next thing that we need to do, you're going to take your bodice lining I should say, okay, which you've been doing all the same stuff to, except it doesn't have the stay tape. You're going to turn up the end just 5/8. So you can see I've already done mine. If you feel uncomfortable turning up the hem 5/8 because you just aren't sure what 5/8 is, remember you can always go to your sewing machine and do a basting stitch at 5/8, and then you can use that as a pressing guideline. I think it's easier just to look quickly at what 5/8 is using a tape measure or looking at your machine and then just turn it up. And as you sew more and more, it will be easier for you to tell what 5/8 is, so you won't have to do that. So I just folded mine over by hand and gave it a good pressing. So that's what that looks like. And now we get to start the fun process of actually putting these together. So we want to do right side up and then right sides together. So right side of the lining to the right side of your nicer fabric, and we're going to start pinning these together. Now I would recommend that you pin the center here first, pin your dots together, or you can match up the tops of the folds like this. I usually just look for where they actually start to part, and then I pin here. And then you're going to pin up through the strap here. Let's go ahead and pin that now actually. Move it down so you can see it. Basically you're going to pin all around this, and the reason is because we're ready to stitch our bodice lining to our top. Okay. And since you have that stay tape in there, it will feel a little thick as you're pinning it. That's okay. It's there to add strength to the seam anyway, so you would expect it to be a little thicker there. Otherwise it wouldn't be doing its job. Now I have to turn this so I can actually pin it. So I'm just going to match up my center here where they start to part. Okay, that looks good. I'll put in a pin there. You have notches here at the neck, so you want to match those up as best as you can. And then you'll just pin throughout. And as I said before with other sections of the project that we've done, if you feel more comfortable having more pins, then just add as many pins as you need. I usually use less pins than this, or sometimes I won't even pin things at all. I'll just sew them through the sewing machine. However, I try not to do that when I'm doing these tutorials because I want to make sure to keep these tutorials simple enough that everybody at any level can use them. So if you are not an experienced seamstress, then you should pin things. It will just make you feel more comfortable as you sew. Looking for my notch, there's my notch. Okay, so that's like a fair amount of pins. All right, now we're also going to be pinning together our longer sides. So we need to pin these sides together now too. So just to show you from the correct viewpoint of your viewpoint, this is the top, this is the bottom. You also need to pin these together. So now I'm going to start pinning those together. For these, you want to match up your side seams. It's a little hard for me to see the side seam in this busy fabric. There we go. Pin together your side seams, and that's because your project will just look so much nicer, and your clothes will look nicer when you wear them if your seams match up. In fact, that's one easy way to tell if somebody has made something themselves, or I guess I should say if they've made something badly themselves, because you'll notice immediately if side seams, or any seams quite frankly, don't match up. If you guys remember that that velvet dress project I made, I spent forever trying to get the seams in the front to match up. That was beastly. Velvet is not fun to work with if you don't have a lot of experience. Will I sew with it again? Probably. Probably will. I didn't learn my lesson the first time. Alright, so I'm just going to put a couple more pins in here. Match up your ends if you can. Okay. So you'll continue pinning that together, and you're going to do the same thing for the other side, pin that together, and then we are just going to stitch this. And we'll stitch here to the center dot. We'll stitch here to the center, and then we will do another stitching line on the other side, okay? So that is the plan. So go ahead and pin this together and then join me at the sewing machine.